went off at exactly 11:47 p.m. Not at a person. Not yet. Just a single shot fired into the ceiling of the private dining room on the 42nd floor of the Hanyang Tower, a warning, a punctuation mark, a declaration. The man holding the gun was director Choi Sung-won, 62 years old, silver-haired, soft-spoken in the way that only truly dangerous men can afford to be soft-spoken. He lowered the weapon slowly, the way a conductor lowers a baton after the final note, and looked across the long mahogany table at the man he had just finished destroying. Kang Ji-ho did not flinch. He sat perfectly still in his chair at the head of the table, the remnants of a celebration dinner growing cold in front of him, the expensive wine, the half-eaten galbi, the untouched dessert. 20 minutes ago, this room had been full of laughter. His laughter. His men. His empire. Now the room held only him, Choi, and 4 men Ji-ho had never seen before, positioned at each corner of the room like chess pieces that had been waiting their entire lives for this particular move. "You've been building this for how long?" Ji-ho asked. His voice was even. Controlled. The voice of a man who had learned long ago that showing fear was the same as bleeding in open water. Choi smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for years. 6 months for the final arrangements. The preparation before that. He tilted his head. 15 years, Ji-ho. I've been watching you make mistakes for 15 years. Name one. You trusted me. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing Ji-ho had ever heard. Outside, 60 stories below, Seoul buzzed and hummed with its beautiful indifference. Neon signs bled color into the Han River. Taxis honked. Couples walked. The city had no idea that the man who had quietly controlled more of it than any elected official was watching his world collapse in real time, one sentence at a time. The accounts are frozen, Choi continued, straightening his cuffs with the unhurried ease of a man reading a grocery list. The properties are transferred. Your men, the ones you trusted, the inner circle, they came to me 3 weeks ago. Not all at once. One by one. The way birds leave a tree before a storm. He paused. You should have paid more attention to the silences, Ji-ho. Silence is always louder than noise. Ji-ho stared at him for a long moment. He was cataloging, calculating, measuring the distance between himself and the nearest exit, the nearest weapon, the nearest option. He found nothing. Choi had prepared for every variable. That, at least, Ji-ho could respect. What happens now? Ji-ho asked. You leave, Choi said simply. That's all. No theater. No bloodshed. You walk out of this building tonight with whatever is in your pockets and you disappear. You try to rebuild, to reach out, to retaliate, and things become significantly less civil. He gestured to the 4 men in the corners. The gesture said everything that didn't need to be said out loud. Ji-ho stood. He adjusted his jacket. He did not look at the table, or the food, or the room that had been his for 11 years. He walked to the door and he opened it himself, because there was no longer anyone to open it for him, and he stepped into the hallway, and he pressed the elevator button and he waited. The elevator came. He got in. The doors closed. And alone in that mirrored box, dropping 42 floors toward a city that no longer belonged to him, Kang Ji-ho pressed his back against the wall, closed his eyes, and for the first time in perhaps 30 years, had absolutely no idea what to do next. He walked out of the lobby into the night air. No car. No driver. No phone. Choi's men had taken it before the dinner, casually, the way you take a weapon from someone you've already beaten. He stood on the pavement outside the Hanyang Tower in a suit that cost more than most people earned in 3 months, and he had nothing. No money. No access. No allies. He was 58 kilograms of muscle, bone, and accumulated ruthlessness, and none of it was worth a single one. He started walking. He didn't know where. He just walked, because standing still felt like dying. It began to rain around midnight. A cold, indifferent soul rain that had no interest in the drama of human lives and simply fell because that was its nature. Ji-ho was soaked within 3 minutes. He kept walking. Past the convenience stores and the pojangmaka tents and the young couples huddled under umbrellas who glanced at him, this drenched, expressionless man in a ruined suit, and looked quickly away. The way people look away from things they instinctively understand are not their problem. He ended up across the street from his own building 40 minutes later. He had not planned to go there. His feet had simply remembered home the way feet do, independent of logic or dignity. He stood in the rain and looked up at his penthouse, the lit windows on the 48th floor. Someone was up there already. Choi's people, going through his things, cataloging his life the way a bank catalogs seized assets. That light that had been his light, coming from his windows, in his home, and he was standing on the pavement below it in the rain like a ghost who hadn't been told yet that he was dead. He was still standing there at 12:20 a.m. when the service entrance door of the building opened and a young woman walked out. She was wearing a plain gray coat over her work uniform, carrying a canvas bag, her hair pulled back neatly. She had her head down against the rain. She was walking fast, the way someone walks when they have 2 buses to catch and no money for a taxi and a mother at home who worries. She had almost passed him entirely when something made her look up. Song Yeon stopped. She looked at him, really looked, which was something almost no one had done to Kang Ji-ho in a very long time. Not at his suit, or his status, or what he represented. Just at him. At the rainwater running down his face. At the particular quality of stillness in a man who has been catastrophically hollowed out and is only now beginning to feel the shape of the emptiness. "Mr. Kang," she said quietly. "Are you all right?" He looked at her. Song Yeon. He knew her name the way you know the name on a badge, information absorbed without intention. She had worked in his penthouse for 2 years. She was efficient and unobtrusive, and she never spoke unless spoken to, and he had never once, in 2 years, initiated a conversation with her. She had been part of the furniture of his life. A good chair that you never thought about until it wasn't there. He didn't answer her question. He wasn't sure he was capable of answering it honestly, and he was too stripped bare at this particular moment for dishonesty. She looked at the building. She looked at him. She looked at the building again, and something moved behind her eyes, comprehension, and then something else, something that Ji-ho recognized with a jolt of something close to shame as pity, though not the condescending kind. The kind that reaches out. "You can stay with me tonight," she said. He stared at her. In 30 years of operating in a world of threats and negotiations and carefully weighed proposals, he was not sure anyone had ever said anything that surprised him more than those 7 words delivered in a quiet voice by a woman in a gray coat standing in the rain outside the building he used to own. "You don't know what you're offering," he said. It came out less like a warning and more like a confession. "I know what I'm looking at," she said. A person standing in the rain with nowhere to go. She shifted her bag to her other shoulder. "That's enough for tonight. Everything else can wait." She started walking. After a moment in which Kang Ji-ho, the most feared man in 3 districts of Seoul, had to make the single most humbling decision of his adult life, he followed her. 2 subway lines and a 7-minute walk brought them to a neighborhood that Ji-ho had driven through perhaps a dozen times in his life, without ever actually seeing. It was the kind of neighborhood that exists in the negative space of every great city, modest apartment buildings shoulder to shoulder, convenience stores lit like small suns, a pojangmaka owner folding up for the night, a dog barking at something that wasn't there. Ordinary. Unglamorous. Alive in a different register than the life Ji-ho had built. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a 6-story building with a slow elevator. The interior was small, a main room, a kitchen separated by a counter, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom that you had to turn sideways to enter comfortably. It was scrupulously clean, which Ji-ho registered automatically, the way a professional always notices the work of another professional. The walls held framed photographs, a small shelf of books, a dying plant that someone had clearly been trying to nurse back to health with fierce optimism. A woman was sitting at the kitchen table. She was perhaps 58, fine-boned, wrapped in a house cardigan, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the specific kind of sharp eyes that belong to people who have been poor long enough to develop an acute talent for reading rooms. She looked at Ji-ho the way you look at an unexpected variable, curious, cautious, but not afraid. "Yama," Yeon said, setting down her bag, slipping off her wet shoes. "This is Mr. Kang. He's going to stay on the couch tonight." "Is he?" said Mrs. Song. "Yes." Mrs. Song looked at Ji-ho for a long moment. "You look like something the rain dragged in," she said, which was so precisely accurate that Ji-ho had no response. "Sit down. I'll make tea." He sat. Yeon disappeared into a closet and came back with a towel and a folded set of clothes, a plain gray t-shirt and sweatpants that were slightly too short for him. "My neighbors," she said simply, handing them over. "He's about your size. Left these when he moved." Ji-ho changed in the small bathroom, hanging his expensive destroyed suit on the towel rack, and came back out wearing the gray t-shirt and too short sweatpants, and something about the absolute absurdity of it, about Kang Ji-ho, who had once made a man cry simply by entering a room, standing in a tiny apartment in borrowed sweatpants, broke something loose in his chest that he chose not to examine too closely. Mrs. Song put tea in front of him without asking what kind he wanted. She sat across from him with her own cup and looked at him the way she had been looking at him since he walked in openly, without performance. "Hard night," she said. "You could say that." "Yeon brings home strays sometimes," she said, not unkindly. "Usually they're in better shape than you." "Yeon," from the kitchen, "Yama." "I'm making conversation," Mrs. Song said serenely. Ji-ho looked at the old woman. He had not been spoken to this way, simply, directly, without fear or strategy, since he was a child, and even then it had been rare. There was something disorienting about it. Like being shown a door in a house you thought you knew completely. "Thank you," he said. He wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking her for. Everything, maybe? The couch was narrow. The blanket was thin. The sounds of the neighborhood filtered through the window, a couple arguing 2 floors down, a motorcycle, rain still falling, a baby somewhere crying and then stopping. Ji-ho lay on his back and looked at the ceiling of Song Yeon's apartment and tried to remember the last time he had been in a space that did not belong to him, that he could not control, that required nothing of him except presence. He could not remember. He didn't sleep for a long time. When he finally did, it was the deepest sleep he'd had in years. He woke to the smell of doenjang jjigae. Mrs. Song was at the stove. The morning light came through the kitchen window at a particular angle that turned everything golden and unhurried. Ji-ho sat up slowly, running his hand over his face, and for exactly 3 seconds before full consciousness arrived, he didn't know where he was. Then he remembered everything, sequentially, like a series of doors slamming. "Sit," said Mrs. Song without turning around. "Jjigae is almost done." He sat at the kitchen table. Yeon came out of her bedroom in her work uniform, hair pinned up, bag already on her shoulder. She looked at him the way you look at someone you've made a decision about and are comfortable with that decision. "I have to go," she said. "I'm on the early shift." She set a key on the table. "For the building entrance. My mother will be here until noon." She paused. "You don't have to stay after that. But you can if you need to." Then she was gone, and Ji-ho was alone with Mrs. Song and a bowl of doenjang jjigae and the slow, bewildering sensation of being taken care of by a stranger. Mrs. Song set the bowl in front of him and sat down across from him with her own and said nothing, which Ji-ho had come to understand in the space of 12 hours was her particular form of hospitality, presence without demand. He picked up his spoon. He tasted the soup. It was extraordinary. Not in the way that expensive food is extraordinary, technique and rarity and theater. It was extraordinary in the way that something made with intention and knowledge and repetition becomes extraordinary, the way a thing becomes beautiful not from effort, but from love applied consistently over a long time. He ate the entire bowl without speaking. Mrs. Song watched him with what appeared to be quiet satisfaction. "You haven't eaten a proper meal in a while," she said. It wasn't a question. "I eat well," he said, which was technically true and entirely false. "You eat expensively," she corrected. Different thing. He had no answer to that. That evening, Yeon came home from the first job, ate quickly, opened her laptop, and started her second job, remote customer service work, headphones on. Speaking in a carefully modulated service voice for 3 hours while Ji-ho sat in the corner trying to be invisible, which was a new and uncomfortable experience. At one point, she pressed her fingers against her temples for a moment between calls, eyes closed. The expression of someone running on a deficit they've stopped calculating because the number is too discouraging. Ji-ho said nothing, but he watched. He had spent his entire adult life watching rooms, reading people, cataloging information. Old habits don't disappear when empires do. The next morning, Yeon handed him a list. It was handwritten, neat, precise. Groceries. She had itemized it by store section. She had written the approximate price next to each item. At the bottom, she had written, "I left 30,000 Korean wons on the counter. Change comes back to me." Ji-ho looked at the list. He looked up at her. "I can't have an extra person eating here without contributing," she said, simply, as though this were perfectly obvious, which, in the world she operated in, it was. "The market is 3 blocks east, turn left at the pharmacy." He stood in the produce section of that market for 4 minutes in front of a display of Korean radishes, holding one, with absolutely no idea what he was doing. A grandmother next to him reached past him, grabbed 3 radishes with the efficiency of long practice, and moved on without acknowledging his paralysis. A child stared at him. He found a young man restocking shelves and said, "I need bean sprouts, Korean radish," and he consulted the list, anchovy stock packets, in a tone that was perhaps slightly more commanding than the situation warranted, and the young man, to his credit, helped him without blinking. He returned with all the items on the list and 2,340 Korean wons in change and set both on the counter. Yeon counted the change without comment and put it in a small ceramic bowl by the sink. Mrs. Song watched this exchange with the expression of someone watching something quietly significant and choosing not to remark on it. That evening, he overheard Yeon on the phone. She didn't know he was awake. It was past 11, and she had stepped into the kitchen for water, speaking quietly, clearly believing everyone was asleep. He lay still on the couch and heard the shape of the conversation without every word. A hospital. A billing department. A number that she kept repeating back with the tone of someone trying to make a number feel less catastrophic through sheer repetition. When she hung up, there was a long silence, and then the very small sound of someone pressing the heel of their hand against their mouth. At the ceiling. He had, in the past 3 weeks, felt many things he was unaccustomed to feeling. This was the one that sat differently. This was the one that felt like something being required of him, some version of himself he had buried under concrete a long time ago, shifting under the surface, pressing upward. He said nothing that night. He filed it in the architectural structure of his memory, load-bearing, and he waited. The next morning, Mrs. Song sat down across from him with 2 cups of barley tea and said, without preamble, "She won't tell you. She doesn't like to make things other people's problems." "I noticed," Ji-ho said. "It's the hospital bill. 6 months of it. The treatment plan is working," but Mrs. Song wrapped both hands around her cup. She was not the kind of woman who complained. She was simply, in this moment, choosing to trust him with information. He understood the weight of that. She took the second job when it started. She hasn't had a day off in 8 months. Ji-ho looked at his tea. "I'm telling you," Mrs. Song said, "not because I want anything from you. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you because you have the face of a man who wants to do something and doesn't know if he's allowed to." She looked at him steadily. "In this house, if you can help, you help. That's the only rule." He nodded once. She picked up her cup and went back to her book, and the subject, as far as she was concerned, was closed. Days passed. 5, then 7, then 10. Ji-ho knew he should leave. He also had nowhere to go, which was a problem he had never encountered in a life that had been defined largely by the construction and maintenance of exits. Every morning he woke on the narrow couch, and every morning Mrs. Song made something for breakfast, and every evening Yeon came home tired, and every night the city outside the window was the same city he had run for years, and it looked completely different from down here. He began doing things. Small things at first, because he could not tolerate inaction. It was against his nature, like asking water not to find its level. He fixed the leaking kitchen faucet with tools he found in a box under the sink. He replaced the flickering hallway bulb. He worked out the timetable of Mrs. Song's medications. She was vague about the schedule, probably to avoid worrying Yeon, and quietly reorganized them by day and time in a little tray on the kitchen counter with a note in his meticulous handwriting. Yeon came home on the 11th day, noticed the medication tray, looked at it for a long moment, looked at him, and said nothing. But something shifted. Not dramatically. Incrementally, the way ice changes in early spring, barely perceptible, and then suddenly, all at once. "Can I ask you something?" she said one night. 14 days in. They were on the narrow balcony with instant coffee because neither of them could sleep. Seoul sprawled below them, not the high-altitude Seoul of his penthouse, all panorama and abstraction, but the close Seoul of this neighborhood, specific and human, lit from inside by the small lamps of individual lives. "You can ask," he said. Which was not quite a yes. "Was there ever a version of your life that looked different? That you wanted more than what you chose?" He went very still. Around them, the city breathed. Someone somewhere was frying something that smelled like garlic. A cat crossed the narrow street below with complete authority. "That's a dangerous question," he said finally. "You're not dangerous right now," she said, and the calm matter-of-factness of it, the complete absence of flattery or threat or agenda, stopped him somewhere in his chest. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "There was a boy," he said, slowly, as though each word had to be extracted from somewhere deep and reluctant. "Before all of this, who wanted to study architecture?" He paused. He was good at it. Spatial reasoning. He could look at a building and understand it from the inside, how the forces moved through it, what was load-bearing, what was decorative. Another pause. His father left when he was 11. After that, other things became more pressing than architecture. Yeon said nothing. She simply listened, in the particular way she had, not collecting information, not preparing a response, just present, receiving. Ji-ho had sat across tables from lawyers and politicians and men whose entire profession was listening and extracting. And none of them had ever made him feel heard the way this 27-year-old woman in a gray coat did on a narrow balcony with a cup of instant coffee. "I don't regret most of it," he said. "I want to be clear about that. The choices were mine. They compounded. I'm not looking for absolution." "I didn't offer any," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't." And for some reason that, too, was a relief. He should have felt the car before he saw it. He was losing his edge. The soft life of this small apartment had dulled something in him, some animal alertness that had kept him alive for 3 decades. He only noticed the black SUV on the 3rd morning it appeared outside the building, parked where a delivery driver might park, engine occasionally running. No plates he recognized. 2 men inside, not looking at the building directly, which was precisely what made them look directly at the building. Choi. Of course. Methodical, patient Choi, who moved like a man who had never once in his life acted impulsively. Ji-ho assessed his options from behind the 4th-floor curtain. The message was clear. Choi knew where he was, and Choi wanted him to know that. Not a direct move. A pressure. A reminder. An invitation to exhaust himself with anxiety or do something stupid. He made his decision that night. He took the small canvas bag Yeon had given him, folded the borrowed sweatpants, stacked them neatly on the couch. He wrote a note, economical, 3 sentences. He picked up the bag. Yeon was in the doorway of her bedroom. She looked at the bag. She looked at him. The apartment was quiet around them, Mrs. Song asleep, the city doing its nocturnal routines outside. "Where are you going?" she asked. He opened his mouth to say something composed and final. What came out was, "I don't know." "Then you're not going anywhere," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was the voice of someone stating an obvious fact, like the address of a building or the time of a bus. "If there's danger, we face it. If you run, you'll always be running. And you're not that person anymore." He stared at her. "You don't know who I am. I've watched you reorganize my mother's medications," she said. "I've watched you spend 40 minutes helping a child from downstairs with his homework when he knocked on the wrong door, and you answered it instead of me. I've watched you cry," his jaw tightened, quietly, on this balcony, at 2 in the morning, when you thought everyone was asleep. She met his eyes. "I know exactly who you are. I knew in the rain outside the building. That's why I brought you here. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had been building for 16 days in a small apartment on the 4th floor of a modest building in a neighborhood that Kang Ji-ho had spent his entire adult life driving past without seeing. He set the bag down. He sat back on the couch. And something in him, something that had been held under enormous pressure for a very long time, released, quietly, like a breath that had been held for 30 years. He still had no army, no money of consequence. No leverage in the conventional sense. What he had was something Choi had never bothered to take, because Choi had never understood its value: memory. Kang Ji-ho's memory was architectural. Total, structural, load-bearing. 20 years of information, account numbers, transaction records, political favors given and received, names attached to things those names never wanted attached to, all of it stored in perfect order in the only vault that Choi had forgotten to empty. But 3 days before he began making contact, something else happened that changed the calculation entirely. Yeon was followed home. She didn't notice. Ji-ho did, from the window, watching without intention. He had not planned to watch. He had simply been standing there thinking. And then he was watching because a man in a dark jacket had been walking at the exact same pace as Yeon for 4 blocks and had stopped when she stopped, and had looked away with the practiced nonchalance of someone trained to surveil. Ji-ho was downstairs in 30 seconds, out the service door, around the back of the building, and positioned on the opposite side of the street before the man in the dark jacket reached the front entrance. He didn't make a scene. He didn't need to. He walked past the man with deliberate slowness and made eye contact for exactly 2 seconds, the kind of eye contact that carries a complete paragraph of information without a single spoken word. The man in the jacket made a phone call and left. Ji-ho went back upstairs. His hands were steady. His heartbeat, however, had done something it had not done in a very long time. It had accelerated. Not from adrenaline or tactical calculation. From something simpler and more ungovernable. He stood in the middle of the small apartment kitchen and breathed through it and recognized it, finally, for what it was. Fear. For someone else. He hadn't been afraid for himself in over 20 years. He had forgotten that this other kind of fear existed. The kind that has nothing to do with your own survival and everything to do with the unbearable prospect of someone you care about being harmed because of who you are. Yeon came in from the hallway. She stopped when she saw his face. "What happened?" she said immediately. He told her. Not to frighten her, he edited for that. But she needed to know, because she was not the kind of woman who could be protected from truth without losing her ability to protect herself, and he had enough respect for her to understand the difference. She sat down at the kitchen table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is this because of you being here?" "Yes." Another silence. He waited for fear or anger or the very reasonable request that he leave. Instead, she looked up at him with that clear-eyed regard that he had come to think of as the most disorienting and most valuable thing he had encountered in his adult life. "Then we deal with it," she said. "Together. Tell me what you need to do." He looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who leaned on people. He did not know, structurally, how it worked, how you accepted the offered weight of another person's strength without either collapsing under the unfamiliarity of it or dismissing it out of habit. He was learning. Slowly. It turned out that learning, at 38, was its own particular kind of courage. "I need a borrowed phone," he said. "And 3 days." "I have a spare," she said, and stood up. He began making contact. Not through phones or emails or anything traceable. He found old channels, a man who owed him a favor and operated a small printing business 3 neighborhoods over, a woman who had once been his bookkeeper and had quietly loathed Choi from their first meeting. Through them, carefully, he sent messages. Not threats. Not demands. Just precise, documented information to people positioned to use it. Detective Park Hyun-soo of the Financial Crimes Unit had been trying to build a case against Kang Ji-ho for 9 years. He was a good detective, patient, incorruptible in the specific way that men who have been offered enough money to be corrupted and refused it are incorruptible, which is the most durable kind. He was on his 3rd cup of coffee of the evening when an envelope arrived on his desk through channels he couldn't quite trace: accounts, transfers, dates, signatures, photographs. Not about Ji-ho. About director Choi Sung-won. Political corruption payments going back 11 years. A trafficking operation that had been running through one of Choi's subsidiary companies for 4 years. 2 deaths that had been ruled accidental. Park looked at the envelope's contents for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his supervisor. "You need to come in," he said. "Tonight." 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, as Ji-ho was helping Mrs. Song repot the plant she had been unsuccessfully nursing, turns out it needed more light and less water, a diagnosis that had taken Ji-ho approximately 90 seconds. His borrowed phone buzzed. A one-sentence message from a number he didn't recognize. "It's moving." He set down the small trowel he'd been using. Mrs. Song looked at him. "Go," she said. She had a way of understanding situations without requiring explanation, which Ji-ho had come to appreciate deeply. He had arranged the meeting through intermediaries, in the neutral space of a tea house in Insadong that was owned by a woman who owed Ji-ho a debt she had never expected to be called in, and was deeply uncomfortable that today was apparently the day. Choi arrived with 2 men. Ji-ho arrived alone, which Choi clearly found either reckless or suspicious, because a small frown moved across his face before his composure reassembled. They sat across from each other. Ji-ho poured tea. Choi waited. "You're not here to threaten me," Choi said finally. "You don't have the resources." "I'm not," Ji-ho agreed. "Then what is this?" Ji-ho looked at him across the tea. He felt, with precise clarity, every year of his life up to this moment, the boy who wanted to study architecture, the choices that compounded, the empire, the rain, the narrow couch, the dungeon jigi, the balcony at 2 in the morning. The moment he set the bag down and sat back down. All of it. Load-bearing. "This is courtesy," Ji-ho said. "You're going to be arrested tomorrow morning. The evidence is already with financial crimes. 3 journalists have independent copies of the documentation for the stories they'll run regardless of what the prosecution decides. The 2 National Assembly members you've been paying for 7 years were contacted 3 days ago, and both of them, in my experience of frightened men, will not hold." Choi had gone very still. "I'm telling you now," Ji-ho continued, "because I'm not the man I was 6 weeks ago. That man would have let you find out in handcuffs, for the theater of it. This is better." He picked up his tea. "Finish your drink. See your family tonight, if you have the decency for it. And understand, I didn't do this to rebuild what you took. I did it because the things you were doing, the things you hid inside my organization without my knowledge, the trafficking, the killings, those needed to stop." He met Choi's eyes. "Some things matter more than winning." Choi looked at him for a long, strange moment. Something moved in his face that Ji-ho couldn't name, not quite fear, not quite respect, something that occupied the territory between them. "You've changed," Choi said quietly. "Yes," Ji-ho said simply. "I have." He walked out of the tea house into the Insadong afternoon, into the smell of autumn and street food and ordinary life, and he did not look back. Detective Park visited him 2 days later. He found Ji-ho at the market. Ji-ho had developed a grocery routine, which was perhaps the most astonishing development in a life full of astonishing developments. And Mrs. Song had very precise opinions about radishes that he had been educated in over several weeks. Park was a medium-sized man with tired eyes and the particular posture of someone who has been right about things for a long time and has paid for it. He fell into step beside Ji-ho without introduction, because they both knew who the other was. "Choi was arrested this morning," Park said. "I know. The evidence package you sent is extraordinary. It's going to be the biggest financial crime prosecution in 10 years. Park paused. "It also, inconveniently, confirms that you existed in the same ecosystem as Choi for 20 years. I know that too. I'm not done with you, Kang Ji-ho. I expected you wouldn't be." Ji-ho stopped in front of a vegetable stall and selected 3 radishes with a confidence that would have been inconceivable 8 weeks ago. "Do what you need to do, detective. Do it correctly. I'll be here." Park studied him for a moment with those tired, accurate eyes. "You're different," he said. "I've been hearing that a lot lately," Ji-ho said, and handed over his money for the radishes and walked on. He came home to find Mrs. Song asleep in her chair with a book on her lap, and he moved through the apartment quietly, starting the soup because Yeon would be home from her second job in 2 hours and she always came home hungry. And he had discovered in himself an unexpected and entirely sincere interest in whether people he cared about had eaten. He was slicing the radishes when he heard the front door open. Yeon came in earlier than expected. She stopped when she smelled the kitchen. She set down her bag. She looked at him at the cutting board, in the too small kitchen, in the apartment he had arrived at 6 weeks ago with nothing and had somehow, in the slow accumulation of small days, come to understand as the most significant address he had ever occupied. "You're early," he said. "They let me go at 8, she said. She came to the kitchen counter and leaned against it and looked at the pot, and at him, and at the pot again. "It smells like my grandmother used to make. I had a good teacher," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Choi was arrested. "Yes. And your accounts, someone told me there was movement. Something unfrozen." He kept his eyes on the radishes. There was one account Choi missed. Small, offshore, from early days. "I had forgotten about it myself." He paused. "Your mother's hospital debt is cleared." Yeon went very still. "Your second job payment arrears are cleared as well." He set down the knife. "I'm aware you didn't ask for this. I'm aware you would not have asked for this, which is," he chose the word carefully, "one of the many things I've come to respect about you." She didn't say anything for a long time. He waited, because he had learned, in 6 weeks, that Song Yeon's silences were not empty. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I know," he said. "Why?" He turned from the cutting board and looked at her. He had spent 30 years moving through the world without ever allowing himself to be fully present in it, always calculating, always measuring, always positioned for the next move. This, right now, the kitchen light and the smell of soup and this woman who had stood in the rain and offered him 7 words, this required no calculation. It simply was. "Because I was standing in the rain," he said, "and you stopped." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved through her expression that he was only beginning to learn to read, not because she was complicated, but because he had been looking at people for so long without actually seeing them. That genuine emotion, unperformed and unconstructed, still caught him off guard. "The soup is going to burn," she said. He turned back to the stove. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning that was bright and cool with the particular clarity of a Seoul autumn, Ji-ho stood in the doorway of the apartment with a small bag, the same canvas bag as before, but lighter, somehow. Mrs. Song was at the table. She had been watching him pack with the serene attention of someone who has seen many things and understands that most of them resolve better than expected. Yeon stood across the room. She had her arms crossed, not defensively, she just didn't know what to do with her hands, which Ji-ho had come to recognize as a tell. It meant she was feeling something she hadn't organized yet. "Detective Park gave me 48 hours before the official process begins," Ji-ho said. "There are arrangements to make. A lawyer. A formal accounting of what I know and what I'm willing to provide." He looked at the floor of the apartment, the slightly uneven boards that he now knew the geography of as well as he had known the marble of his penthouse. "After that, I don't know exactly what the shape of things looks like. Will you be all right?" Yeon asked. "I think so," he said, which was honest. It was neither a guarantee nor a dismissal. Just the truth. Mrs. Song stood up from her chair. She crossed the room, and she put her arms around him, and she held on with the particular strength of small women who have carried large things their entire lives. Ji-ho froze for exactly 2 seconds, the muscle memory of 30 years of not being held fighting with the 6 weeks of this apartment, and this family, and this narrow couch, and then he put his arms around her back, and held on. "Come back," she said into his shoulder. "I will," he said. He let go. He picked up the bag. He looked at Yeon. She was looking at him with that clear, unguarded expression, the one she had worn in the rain on the first night, the one he had spent 6 weeks learning to deserve. "I'll come back," he said. "If that's all right." She considered him. For a long, unhurried moment she simply looked at him, the way she had looked at him from the beginning, not at what he had been, not at what he might become, just at who he was standing in her doorway right now. A man who had built an empire and lost it and found something that mattered more. A man who had learned to buy radishes and fix pipes and notice when someone was crying on a balcony at 2 in the morning. A man who had arrived in the rain with nothing and was leaving with everything that actually counted. "Bring groceries," she said. He almost smiled. It was close enough to a smile that Mrs. Song, behind him, made a small, satisfied sound. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. The doors opened. He got in, and this time when the doors closed, the reflection he saw in the mirror was not the face of a man standing at the edge of an abyss. It was just his face. His, for the first time, not built for power or fear or survival. Just a man on his way somewhere, with intentions to return. The most feared man in 3 districts of Seoul had lost his empire, his penthouse, his army, and his name. What he found instead, in a thin blanket apartment on the 4th floor of a building in a neighborhood he had spent 30 years driving past, was the only thing that had ever truly belonged to him. Himself. And the number of the building, which he had already memorized. Not because he needed to. Because he wanted to. If this story moved you the way it moved us writing it, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and ring the bell. We drop new stories every week. Drop a comment below. What moment hit you the hardest? We read every single one. We'll see you in the next story.